Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on Beyond Ofsted, the future of school inspection. My name is Dr. Bernardita Muñoz Chedó, and I am an associate professor at the IOE UCL Center for Educational Leadership, and I will be chairing today's lecture. And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Jane Perryman and Alice Bradbury. But before I do this, I wanted to say that the Beyond Ofsted research is very close to my heart, as I was member of its advisory panel. So in a way, I saw it developing from a little acorn to a mighty oak, so to speak, in the course of the last year. So Jane is a professor of sociology of education at the IOE UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. She's primarily interested in how policy affects the professional lives of teachers. She researches issues around accountability, performativity, and inspection, policy enactment more generally, and teacher retention. She works with qualitative methodologies, particularly interviewing and using case studies. And she was the principal investigator of the Beyond Ofsted project. And Alice is a professor of sociology of education at the IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. She's also the co-director of the Helen Hamlin Center of Pedagogy from 0 to 11 years, a research center that focuses on early years and primary education. Alice's research specializes in the impact of education policy on classroom practices and inequalities, with a particularly focus on issues of assessment and accountability in early years and primary schools. And she was also the co-investigator on the Beyond Ofsted project. So before we begin, I wanted to let you know that Jane and Alice will present for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will have time at the end of their lecture for Q&As. So questions can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido. So you need to enter into your internet browser Slido, and then you need to enter the event code, which is #BeyondOfsted. So I will now hand over to Alice and Jane for their talk.
Thank you, Bernie. So what we're going to be doing in this lecture is we're going to talk about the Beyond Ofsted project itself. We're going to give you a little bit of background to the arguments for and against Ofsted in the academic literature. I'm going to talk a little bit about how inspection actually works in England, or certainly worked at the time that we were doing the research. And then I'm going to give you some headlines from the research, and then Alice and I are both going to present in a little bit more detail some of the qualitative research. We're calling that a deep dive for our own amusement. So the Beyond Ofsted project included a literature review. We did an international comparison of inspection systems. The bulk of our research was a survey of around 7,000 teachers and leaders, which we conducted in March and through to May 2023. We also did focus groups at the NEU conference and also online in June 2023. And those focus groups also included parents and governors. And we had an advisory board of which Bernie was a member, and consulted expert views as well. So some views on Ofsted as background. To the left there are what Ofsted says about itself, that it provides essential information, provides a good safeguarding function, it's independent. Amanda Spielman, the previous chief inspector, famously called it a force for improvement. And then Chris Husbands, an academic, pointed out that it has the most comprehensive and thorough evidence base on what happens in classrooms anywhere in the world. And I think Ofsted's research arm is generally viewed as a great advantage. However, Research has shown that it adds to teachers' stress and workload. It can have a negative impact on teaching and learning. In particular, I argue that schools very much focus on doing what Ofsted wants rather than what is important for the schools, and I'll be talking about that in this lecture later. We've also seen that poor inspection outcomes disproportionately affect disadvantaged schools and their communities. And there are also questions about the neutrality and expertise of inspectors. So round about the time we did the research, Ofsted was very much in the news. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background of how inspection was working and then how it was being presented in the news. So for anybody who is new to inspection, we've had Ofsted inspections in England since 1992. I say England deliberately because education is a devolved function of government. We've had several changes in framework, but the framework that was in operation when we did this research was 2019. We're expecting a full new framework in 2025, and there has already been changes which are leading into that. And under the 29 framework, inspections were happening every 4 years, and schools were being notified between 9:30 and 2 p.m. Recently, that was the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the day before the inspection, but now it will just happen on the Monday. This is to reduce the stress of waiting for the phone call. So what happens is the head teacher will have a 90-minute phone call with the inspection team. There will then be a 2-day inspection involving deep dives, work scrutiny, lesson observations. The outcomes will be shared at a feedback meeting, which is not yet made public. This is another recent change. Previously, head teachers were told the outcome of the inspection and they personally had to keep it a secret completely, but now they are allowed to tell certain stakeholders. And the school receives a report and it's published on the Ofsted website. So, before the pandemic, Ofsted was in the news. There we have Amanda Spielman talking about how Ofsted can add to the teach the test mentality, and various schools sometimes challenged their inspection grades. What happened directly after the pandemic was Ofsted downgraded hundreds of outstanding schools in England. This was because many schools had not been inspected since 2011, 2012, because once they had an outstanding grade, they were released from inspection. But Ofsted went in with a new framework and many were downgraded. And this caused quite a lot of controversy. But things really came to a head with the death of Ruth Perry. This was a very, very sad case where a head teacher called Ruth Perry, her school was inspected, it was downgraded from outstanding to requires improvement. And the Ofsted inspection happened sometime before Christmas, and over the Christmas holidays. So worried and concerned was Ruth Perry about the inspection outcome, its effect on the school, the community, even house prices, that she committed suicide. And that is not me making the connection between that and Ofsted, but there was an independent inquiry into her suicide, which concluded that Ofsted had contributed to her death. This then led to a massive outpouring of anti-Ofsted media coverage. Very aptly says here, the dam has burst on the strength of feeling. So then you had teachers and head teachers calling for Ofsted to replace, an ex-inspector talking about how it was unfit for purpose. Schools started to take Ofsted to court over inspection, and various unions saying that Ofsted should be abolished. And this culminated in MPs launching an inquiry into school inspections. So all this was happening. You will see on these last 2 dates here, that was April 2023, one of the unions talking about abolishing, and June 2023, the inquiry was launched. So we were doing a lot of our work during this time happening. I think it must be acknowledged that a lot of the more emotive things that people said about inspection were actually said during this time when Ofsted was very much in the news, and very much in the news for the wrong reasons. So let's have a look at some of the headlines. First of all, these two sets of data here. Just to focus firstly on the pie chart, I think in all the data and everything we present, it's very important to note that over 80% of the respondents to our survey were from schools that had been classed as good or outstanding, over 80% of them. So we like to make the point very early on that this is not a survey of the disgruntled. The vast majority of our respondents were from schools which were doing well in the inspection system. Despite this, most of our respondents said that their experience of Ofsted was either very or somewhat negative. In terms of perceptions of Ofsted, there is disagree to the left and agree to the right. So as you can see, people disagreed that Ofsted made them feel empowered. They didn't feel they could voice their concerns, and they didn't feel the inspectors had the necessary expertise to make their judgments. What they did feel was they had experienced higher levels of personal stress. They said there was an increase in workload, and that they changed their normal practice according to the Ofsted inspection. The problems of Ofsted, according to our respondents, were that it was not seen as a reliable arbiter of standards or a force for improvement. It wasn't seen as a valid means of holding schools to account. It created more work which wasn't manageable. People also said that it stifled innovation, it undermined senior leaders, and it introduced harmful burdens, as well as having a negative impact on retention. So I'm now going to hand over to Alice to look at some of those in more detail.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to begin this section where we look a little bit in a bit more depth. We dig a bit deeper into the data we collected. We're going to look at how people experience Ofsted and some of the problems with inspection. So to begin with, just looking at how people responded to these two questions about their overall experience of inspection and their feelings when Ofsted are coming. These are the word clouds from the responses, hundreds and hundreds of responses. And you can see that there are many kind of very negative words about stress and pressure and dread all the way through these. You'll note that on the one on the left there, the word good actually appears quite large, which means it came up quite a lot in the data. But when we have to look at what was with that word good, it was often not good or not good enough. So that kind of explains that slight anomaly of a more positive word in there. But generally, you get this picture of the kind of level of stress and pressure that people are feeling during Ofsted, but also when they know that they're coming. When we asked about experiencing higher levels of personal stress, so again, this is a large number of responses here, whatever level teachers are working at, whether they're classroom teachers or middle leaders or senior leaders, they were strongly agreeing overwhelmingly that there was an increase in personal stress. Though it is interesting to note, of course, that the senior leaders, that's head teachers and deputy heads, more of them were strongly agreeing that they experienced that increase in personal stress, and that may be because of that extra responsibility and feeling like it's a judgment on your leadership. If we think about how inspection made people feel about their career, which is obviously an important issue in an era when teacher retention is a significant problem for the sector, I just want to highlight here that about 60% of our respondents said no to the idea of Ofsted wanting them to stay in the education profession, and about 35% said that it made them want to leave their current school. So we can certainly see that there is this is reconfirming a relationship which people have previously argued between Ofsted and the problem of retention. So if we look at a little bit more detail at some of the kind of quotes, you get the sense of the kind of human impact of Ofsted, the sort of human cost really that the inspections create. So there is, you see in these quotes, people talking about intense pressure and stress, right from the phone call till the end, people not sleeping, finding it grueling and extreme stress. And we had dozens and dozens, these are not kind of unusual comments, we had dozens and dozens of comments like this about the kind of physical and mental effects of the stress induced by Ofsted inspections. There are also impacts like this final one here, where the teacher missed her daughter's nativity play, thinking that people were missing important family events and so on because they were had to be in school because of the pressures of Ofsted. So clearly it was having a significant effect on people within schools before and after inspection. If we go back back to the aftermath, thank you. So the interesting thing also is it's not over once the judgment has been declared on the school. In cases where you are judged to be inadequate or requires improvement, there can be really significant professional implications. So in this example, which is certainly not unusual, school was found to be inadequate and the head teacher took the blame and resigned and left the profession. This teacher also left the profession and went to work abroad. In the second one, we had someone retiring early, and also again saying that their staff were exhausted and that they couldn't place any further demands on them. So we see that, you know, the consequences are quite significant for the sector. We get lots of head teachers leaving schools, leaving the profession or retiring early, and we lose all of that expertise and that experience because often Ofsted come and people make that decision that they just cannot cope anymore with a system that is really, you know, seen to be hugely damaging. There's also the reaction, of course, amongst the staff, and as we can see here, this teacher is describing how everyone was burnt out, ill and physically exhausted, and this sort of sense of demoralisation. 6 out of 12 class teachers resigned, and after another inspection, 5 teachers resigned. So there is this really, excuse me, there is a really important effect here about the kind of system-wide impact in terms of retention of just how much pressure Ofsted is causing. And the key thing really here is in this last quote is that the whole process was exhausting, unnecessary, and provided no new information to move us forward. So all of this negative impact is happening without actually being helpful. And that is one of the really key findings that we have emphasised from our Beyond Ofsted study, that it has this both a negative effect, but also that it really isn't a helpful process. We also get this problem of expertise and consistency. So a lot of comments talking about how unpredictable it can be, which obviously adds to the anxiety, not knowing how you're going to be judged or by whom. So you get this problem of, you know, sometimes you might get an inspector who is really reasonable or really experienced, but there is always this fear that you're going to get someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And as you see on the right-hand side here, there's, you know, it's easy to make comparisons between different inspections if you've been through several. And this teacher is saying, you know, this time we had a good one, they were experienced, they showed consideration for the children and consideration for the staff. But on 2 previous inspections, they've actually had to make formal complaints. So clearly it isn't always the case that the inspectors do show any care about children or indeed about staff. On the next one, we see again, this is someone who's been through 17 inspections, clearly a very experienced school leader, and they have a way even of categorizing the different kinds of inspectors, the bad ones who are rigid and box ticking, obsessed with data, don't understand the context. And then this teacher contrasts this with brilliant HMIs, those are inspectors who actually make a real difference. They plant ideas in your head which last your whole career, and how they inspire you to be a better school. But unfortunately, it ends with saying we haven't met one of them in a long time. So there is a feeling of slight decline as well among some comments, that actually there aren't as many experienced inspectors who are able to really understand a school, understand its context, and actually help, which is the key thing that head teachers want. The difference we see really is between an interrogation versus a collaboration. And again, we're just contrasting here the positive, the inspector who clearly listened, compared to an inspector who showed no empathy. And what we find is that they're actually, if you ask head teachers what they want, what it could look like, that theme of collaboration comes out very strongly. That actually, that if you had a system where head teachers could work with an inspector, could talk about what might be improved, there would be some kind of developmental feedback system, that would be a much more preferable system to something where people feel like the entire inspection is just simply done to them. I'm now going to hand over to Jane to talk about preparation for Ofsted.
Thank you, Alice. So one of the key findings from our work was how much the whole work of schools was spent in preparation for Ofsted. So these were the responses to an open question about what sort of things the school did to prepare for Ofsted. As you can see, there are a plethora of activities, but I think the key one is right at the bottom there, where only 3% of our respondents said they did nothing special for Ofsted. So whilst many of these things may be good things to do anyway, it might be good to have, I'm struggling to think of something that might be good anyway. It might be good to have training on curriculum reviews, but a lot of these things were perceived by the teachers and the head teachers as things that took time away from what they should be doing in order to do the best for their students. And I was reminded when reading that data that these criticisms of Ofsted have been around since Ofsted first arrived in the 1990s. So here there are 3 quotations from academics in the 1990s talking about those concerned also come to anticipate the response to their actions past, present and future, and therefore come to discipline themselves. So that's people in schools doing what they think Ofsted wants, and sometimes not even being asked to do that. Ball famously said that schools become an organisation for the gaze and for the avoidance of the gaze, using the Foucauldian notion there. And Perryman talks about inspectors being the absent presence in the school. This was the idea that it's not just when schools are inspected that they are affected by inspection, but before, after and during. And if you think about all those things schools are doing in between inspections to prepare for inspection, that's an example of inspectors being the absent presence in the school. The House of Commons inquiries that I mentioned earlier did in fact talk about this particularly. Schools talked about second guessing what Ofsted might want, saying there is never a day when Ofsted is not mentioned. And there was much talk about everything in the school was about ticking the Ofsted boxes. Now, to be fair to Ofsted itself, they are often involved in fighting what they call these common misconceptions and myths about inspection. And they agree that it causes unnecessary workload. Amanda Spielman there told the inquiry she was really concerned that people use Ofsted to push junior staff into doing more than they needed to do, and highlighted that Ofsted has done blogs, webinars, seminars, etc. to counteract these misconceptions. But this doesn't stop there being an entire industry built around preparing for Ofsted inspections. I'm not saying anything about any of these organisations. I just plucked out pictures on the web. There are many more. But as you can see, these are companies who are offering for money expert help with Ofsted inspections, pre and post Ofsted reports, inspection consultancies. What do inspectors want to see? 5 tips for an Ofsted inspection. And Ofsted's denial of the fact that there is something they want, that there isn't a recipe that they want to see, was rather undermined, again, round about the time that we were doing our research with the crib sheet, how can I call it? Crib sheet gate, where it was discovered that Ofsted inspectors had crib sheets like this one I show you as an example. This is the primary English aide-memoire, and there was one for all the other subjects across primary and secondary. And it's really difficult to see how, if you're a school that's worried about your Ofsted outcome and wants to prepare for it, that you wouldn't go straight to this crib sheet and prepare according to what Ofsted want. Now, the problem for schools with this was that these crib sheets were training materials for Ofsted inspectors, and there was much outcry about whether they should be released to all schools, because of course some inspectors were giving them to schools that they were helping and others weren't. And in the end, they were released on the internet, so everybody had them. So therefore, this leads to such things as people talking about everything is focused on what Ofsted might want to see, or indeed the latest rumours about what they might want to see. People talked about lessons becoming formulaic and boring. And then somebody explains here, if a school is going to be positively or adversely impacted by the judgment awarded, then of course every aspect of the school is going to be, to a greater or lesser extent, geared towards attaining a positive judgment. Therefore, everything that the school does is considered against the Ofsted framework and what impact the work will have in helping to attain a positive judgment. I think some people might perhaps just say, well, what is actually the point, that the problem with this? If Ofsted is inculcating these standards and good ways of teaching and everything into schools, and teachers do it, then standards are presumably driven up. I think the big cost to the teaching profession is that teachers don't tend to go into schools so that they can teach formulaic and boring lessons and tick lots of boxes. And this is, in our data, directly linked to the retention issues, which Alice spoke about earlier. So as a final couple of points about this whole inspection as a performance. Again, the problem of inspection as a performance is, as the first quotation says here, it can be a false representation of what the school is like. This one talks about the school being flooded with staff from other schools in the trust. It got outstanding, but was it a true picture of the school? People talked about putting on a show all the time, being warned by leadership to be careful of what they said to an inspector, people being called out to have meetings with inspectors. And this one, the final one, the inspection itself felt incredibly scripted. Staff had been Ofsted prepped over an extended period, and we knew exactly what to say to tick the right boxes. And going back to Alice's point earlier about the toxicity of Ofsted and how it's affecting schools negatively, if the corollary of that is that schools over prepare and they're not actually giving a true notion of the school, so therefore Ofsted isn't judging the school as it should be judged, but judging some performance that it puts on, then it's not even fit for the purpose of actually judging schools properly. And I shall now hand back again to Alice.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other issues raised to do with the context of the school. So one of the problems that was quite prevalent in our data was the issue about local issues being ignored, particularly issues to do with the level of deprivation and of the community the school is serving. And this question about whether inspectors were really able to understand that on a short visit, and whether they were really going to take all of these kind of contextual issues into account. So on the left here, you've got a quote from a teacher who works with in a school with a high percentage of English as an additional language, EAL pupils. She says that, actually that they're spending so much time preparing for Ofsted, they're having mock steads every few weeks, and it's taking more and more time away from the children. And on the right here, we have another one saying, will the inspectors understand? And there was this general feeling that in many cases, inspectors were going to arrive, they're going to judge the school, and they weren't really going to appreciate what this respondent says about staff giving their utmost love and kindness every day. Will Ofsted see this? There are also issues, I think it's worth mentioning, about some of these bigger policy concerns about SEND provision for children with special educational needs and disabilities, student mental health, also the impact of the pandemic, feeling that all of that was being ignored when schools were being inspected and judged. The next couple of slides are about some of the findings that are very specific to primary education, which is my field. So when we had did a comparison of responses from primary and secondary, although broadly they were similar in terms of the kind of overall headline figures, there were some issues raised in the open responses in the primary section, which weren't there at all in the secondary section. And a lot of that is to do with the size of primary schools, but also the setup of responsibility. So in a primary school, each subject has a teacher who is responsible for that subject, coordinating that subject, but they also have to teach their own class and they have to teach all of the subjects. And that's quite a different setup to a secondary school where you might have a head of department of, say, geography and several geography staff, and they teach different year groups, but they do only teach geography. So we found that there were really unrealistic demands, which kept being cited in our data, about the current framework being inappropriate and unrealistic for the setup of primary schools. They were saying that teachers cannot have a picture of every subject and every lesson across the school, and that primary should not be inspected for things like subject leadership in the same way as secondary schools. They don't get paid any extra to lead a subject often, unless it's maths or English, and they don't get any time to do so. So actually expecting teachers to have that kind of level of coverage and level of knowledge is just completely unrealistic. And then on the right here, this head teacher is talking about small schools. And we have to remember, of course, that primary schools can be very different. Some primary schools are very, very small. Some primary schools are very large. And so there are huge differences between them. And on a small school, it can have a huge impact whether when an inspector comes, because everyone is involved. Often the head teacher themselves is responsible for several subjects. And it felt very unfair to these heads to be judged against in exactly the same way as a secondary school, which has a whole kind of senior leadership team. And there's generally a feeling, which we get in that it's quite a common perception between primary and secondary anyway, that there is a feeling that the system is geared towards secondary and primaries are a bit of an afterthought. And certainly this head feels like inspection is very much geared towards secondary schools. If we go to the next one, thank you. The deep dive system, where you go and inspectors arrive and they focus very much on one particular subject, was seen as particularly inappropriate in small schools, because there's absolutely no way that you can have that kind of knowledge about several subjects. It leaves teachers like this one on the bottom left here feeling rubbish, because she feels like she isn't doing her job, but she says, I'm a teacher, I'm not a subject lead, I'm a teacher. I have done that job, but you've made me feel like I haven't. So often it can have quite negative effects on teachers. And then finally, again, we get this same problem about the size of schools, the levels of responsibility, the time that people have to actually understand their subject specialism. There's also a particular issue for amongst primary and particularly early years teachers in primary, people who teach nursery and reception, who are inspected when primary inspections happen, that actually there isn't any expertise amongst the inspectors about early years. This top one says, they don't really get it. They don't really understand what we're doing. And again, there is this problem of a kind of hierarchy within the schools, meaning that sometimes you've got someone who is a secondary specialist coming and inspecting primary, didn't really get it in the other direction, but you got, this example, a secondary English specialist coming and looking at primary math in the early years foundation stage and making claims that were factually inaccurate. So they said definitely we wouldn't go and inspect secondary. There's no reason why they should be coming to inspect the early years. And again, this is the point about the entire system being really geared towards secondary without really understanding the differences between the two. And also, I would argue, the differences within the primary sector, because you do get this huge amount of variation. Right, I'm going to hand back now to Jane.
Thank you, Alice. So those were our main findings about inspection, the experience of inspection, the problems of inspection. But really, the point of the Beyond Ofsted inquiry was to think about alternatives to inspection. There was really nothing in our findings about inspection that surprised me as somebody who'd been doing research into inspection for many years. But what we really wanted to know was what could be done about it. And when we presented this data at BERA back in autumn of this year, almost the first question that we got was somebody going, but shouldn't schools be accountable? And we wanted to emphasize the fact that our respondents did think that inspection should help schools identify strengths and weaknesses, and it should help make sure every child has access to high quality education. And they thought the safeguarding aspect of inspection was important, as was raising standards. So nobody, well, there were a small minority who thought there should be no inspection at all. But even those people in the qualitative data acknowledge that as organisations that spend public money, there does, of course, need to be accountability in schools. But 79% of our respondents wanted to see a complete overhaul of how inspections work. And the themes of what our respondents said about this were they wanted grades to be removed and for there to be a move more towards support. They wanted the inspectorate itself, the people who do it, to be largely reformed. They wanted a system which reduced stress and increased trust. And they also wanted a reform to the safeguarding functions. There was a very, very strong desire for change, including calls for an immediate pause. So whilst we asked our survey and focus group people how they thought inspection should change, we also conducted a survey of international inspection systems. And I just include this slide here as an example of the sort of things we looked at. So we used the PISA rankings, controversial as they are, to look at schools above and below England in the education rankings. And we looked in detail at all these aspects about when an inspection is done, who inspects, what is inspected, what evidence is gathered, how reporting is done, and the rule of inspectorate post-inspection. And as you can see just from this small sample, there are different dots in every single column because nearly every country does inspection differently. Some countries do not even have an inspection system. They would class it more as evaluation. And our conclusion looking at these international comparisons was that England's inspection system was a bit of an outlier in that it was the least trust-based and the most high stakes of all inspection systems. So we recommended, as a result of all this, the following recommendations. I don't want to go through these in great detail as time is marching on and we need questions. All this is obviously available in the report we published around a year ago now. But essentially, the point of the recommendations from the Beyond Ofsted report was that inspectors would be removed from schools themselves, and inspection should focus on how local education authorities and trusts conducted school improvement. So schools would self-evaluate, they would work with school improvement partners. It would be honest evaluation and honest identification of targets, and then they would be helped to improve and capacity build. And the inspection itself would be making judgments about how this improvement was being supported rather than the actual performance of the school itself. Importantly, we recommend that the safeguarding audits should still be conducted, but they should be separate from inspection, and they should be conducted annually by separate bodies. And we also, of course, argued that the inspectorate should be informed in terms of its training and expertise, and that it should be fully independent of government. So, what has happened since? Well, there was an election with a new government, which does mean that perhaps there is more scope for change than there would have been at the time that we were doing the report. We've had Beyond Ofsted. Ofsted itself conducted its own survey, which it called the Big Listen. There was an alternative Big Listen, which was conducted by HMI, who disagreed with the way that Ofsted had framed its questions. And there was also the House of Commons inquiry. All these combined with the new government have led to the following suggested reforms, which will be part of the new inspection framework, although some are happening immediately. So there will no longer be any overall grades. There will be a report card. There will be annual safeguarding checks, and there will be a grace period for fixes. So schools won't immediately fail their safeguarding. They will be given a chance to fix whatever that might be. There is a plan to have new phase appropriate frameworks. So that will address some of the problems Alice talked about in terms of the primary school problems, although the curriculum focus would stay. Reports will apparently take local context into account and emphasize inclusion. And there is also talk of trust and map level inspections in the future. So at that point, I'm going to finish and hand over to our chair.
Thank you so much, Jane and Alice, for this really detailed presentation. And we have very, very engaging audience with really interesting questions. Some of these had been addressed, but I would like to start with the first question that it says, do other countries have a version of Ofsted that actually works? So I think is going back into the comparative approach. Maybe there's something there to say about what you found in terms of those differences and similarities.
Yes, as I touched upon then, I would say all countries have some form of school evaluation. Some countries say that it is not an inspection. Where it does work, it works when it is collaborative. It allows the schools to be honest about the problems they may be facing so that they can get proper support. And it also works where it is not perceived as being high stakes. So schools can again ask for support and know that they're not in the risk of, for example, the whole of the leadership team being sacked. So there are actually examples from around the world of much more collaborative and supportive systems. And that's, I think, part of the model behind our recommendations.
Thank you. There's another question that says, how do you think the new Labour government will affect school inspections regulations? So you mentioned a little bit what happened after the report, but what will be the main changes in your view?
So if I'll take this one. So the main thing that's happened already is that they have scrapped the one-word judgments. That's the calling schools good, outstanding, requires improvement, or inadequate. And that came into effect this term, so immediately, basically, from this government. And I think that's welcome, because one of the things we called for was an immediate pause. So, you know, it's excellent that they've kind of done something straight away and acted, you know, without spending a year having a review and leaving everyone with this system that isn't working very well. So that's a positive. There are some negatives, obviously, because the current system is still operating. You still get judgments with those terms, but on all of your different areas that the school inspects, that the Ofsted inspect. So, you know, it isn't a perfect solution, but it's a kind of interim solution before we move towards a new system of report cards. Report cards are, I think, still under discussion. I think on all the conversations we've had, it's very tricky to get a balance between having the right kind of information on report cards, not making them so long that they become completely unmanageable and not useful for parents, but equally not turning into some other, you know, replication of the whole kind of 4 single word judgment with, you know, you just get put in 4 categories. So I think it really does remain to be seen. But I think one of the things that we probably would emphasize from all of the discussions with many different kind of stakeholders through Beyond Ofsted is that any changes really need to take into account that strength of feeling about Ofsted. You know, so many people in our survey said that we should abolish it completely. It's toxic as a brand, and so on. And so that kind of strength of feeling about how negative Ofsted have become has got to inform whatever changes. And many people want really quite fundamental change. I think that's the lesson from our data.
Thank you. There's a question that follows nicely from that, and because you described the negative impacts or effects from inspection, but this question is asking if you found any evidence of positive outcomes from Ofsted inspections.
I'll take that. I think it's always important to note that we are talking about the majority of schools which are well run, teachers are doing their best, and for those schools, the problems that we have talked about in this lecture can affect those schools. There was some evidence in the data from some teachers who thought that they were in a school that wasn't run very well, and the senior leadership team were not doing what was best for the students. And they, in many ways, welcomed an external eye coming and being able to affect change. But I think that was kind of quite a small minority of cases. So we wouldn't want the sledgehammer to crack the nut because of a small minority of schools that aren't working. And also we should ask themselves, well, that can't be right, can it, to let a school be run badly for 5 years and rely on external inspection to come along and happen to see what's really happening, given all the gaming of the rules and all the performance that schools will be putting on. And so therefore we hope that our recommendation to actually inspect how school improvement is run across an authority or across a trust would crack down on that, because in that circumstance then you couldn't have a school that was really badly run. I think also perhaps there are some schools who may benefit from getting an outstanding label and being able to sell itself to parents as that. But those are the only positive outcomes that I think we saw in the data.
Thank you. There's another really interesting question asking if you could offer some reflections of what an ideal approach to an accountability-based education system would look like. You already mentioned self-evaluation, reducing the stress or the high stakes, but maybe could you elaborate a little bit more about what would be an ideal approach?
I think I think there's some interesting models. If you look internationally, you know, there is a sort of continuum of support and punitive, and towards the more supportive end, there are models of inspection which is done with collaboration, with self-evaluation, and so on, which obviously fed into our recommendations. And the thing that comes out from certainly from some of the head teacher focus groups that we did was that they had examples of relationships and situations which they saw as being very helpful to their school and really key to improving their school, where they were able to talk about what needs to be improved, to talk through what they felt that they were really good at, and to try and move the school forward. And they wanted inspection to be like that. They wanted it to be helpful, and they wanted it to be collaborative rather than feeling like they were being checked on. And so I think the models, the kind of ways in which it really seems to work, if those things are happening outside of the inspection system, in other kind of more informal, within trusts or within local authorities, we need to move inspection more into that kind of framework, where we know that works because head teachers have already had that experience, which means really shifting a lot of the kind of accountability side of it out of inspection. School improvement becomes something separate from a kind of accountability checking up on schools agenda.
Thank you. There's a question that brings us back to the past. It says, were there regulatory bodies like Ofsted before the 90s where it came about?
Indeed, there were. We have had an inspection system in England since the 1870s. We had Her Majesty's Inspectorate, which was an inspection regulatory body. The difference was, and I actually speak from experience here because I was a teacher in 1990 before Ofsted took over. They were very much seen as an independent body, which would actually be more involved in helping improvement rather than judging and writing reports and leaving. So, for example, when I was a teacher in 1990, HMI would come in, you'd have a white and honest conversation with them. They might suggest to me as a history teacher that history was being taught better down the road, and why didn't I go and have a look at it? So yes, there were inspectors, but it wasn't the same high stakes, low trust system.
Thank you. Given everything discussed about inspection, are these recommendations enough to enact positive change for teachers?
Well, I suppose we would hope so. We have, you know, been forcefully arguing alongside many other educational bodies for a long time, and particularly I think there is a feeling of that something has to change amongst the sector. Quite what will happen politically, I think, is a bit unknown. And really, I mean, my hope is that through the course of this term of Parliament, even if not immediately, there might be some change, but it just has to be that it needs to be the political will to really make a kind of fundamental shift, and that isn't currently there, I don't think.
Thank you. There's a question that says, often Ofsted talk about being more transparent in the Big Listen, and will bring in rubrics that tell schools about evidence collection. So what are the implications for a movement in that direction?
I think it all depends how these things are perceived by schools. As I said earlier when I was talking about putting on a show, Ofsted currently says loudly, please don't do anything special for us. But we all know that there is an industry of preparation for Ofsted, and schools do indeed do preparation. So if this is something else that is added to a list of things that schools have to do, then obviously it will add to the stress and workload. If it is a recommendation, people will still see it as a list of things to do. And if it is neither of those, then there probably isn't any point in having it.
Thank you. There's a question that links nicely with this. It says, the burden on SLTs is already large. So will adding another layer of responsibility of reporting, as you suggest, will be adding to that workload, and how does it differ?
Shall I carry on, Alice? Yeah. I think, again, this is about how it is perceived. If we have a layer of school self-evaluation and reporting that is open, honest, warts and all, come and help us improve, it shouldn't actually add to workload, because schools shouldn't really have to prepare for that. But I think the danger is always that this, whatever reform happens, is still within the discourse of high stakes and schools having to perform in order to pass inspection at whatever level that is.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about the latest announcements. So the participant is asking, what are your views on the new focus on inclusion as announced at the CST conference this week? This idea of including inclusion as one of the key aspects of inspection.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that what Bridget Phillipson said at that conference about well-being and trying to factor in the child as a whole, and also the issues about inclusion. One of the things that, of course, could be on a report card are some kind of measures or assessment of how well a school really caters for the whole child and caters for their mental health and so on. I think some of those things are quite challenging. One of the things that I think I personally would like to see is some data about off-rolling and issues of inclusion on the report card, because that would encourage schools to really ensure that they're catering for all of their pupils. I'd also like to see figures on to what extent they represent their local community, what levels of free school meals they have, and so on, so that we get that kind of contextual information, and then we can understand their results or the other data that we have within that kind of context. So, I mean, in general, I think I would welcome what Phillipson is saying, really, about how we shouldn't be judging education purely in terms of exam results. But I do think there are some practical and also quite conceptual issues that need to be worked out about how that translates into something like a report card, and whether you can really represent some of those subtleties. And I personally think we should have some kind of a narrative in elements of a report card, and we should also let schools talk about themselves in a report card and give this an account of themselves to contextualize any data, because it may be that they have excellent provision for children with special educational needs, or they may have an excellent kind of wellness program or for their staff or whatever, and some of those things are not currently really captured. So I think allowing schools to not only have some input into it, but kind of tell a story about themselves would be another way to make it a fairer system of reporting.
Thank you. So we are reaching the end of our lecture hour. I really want to thank Alice and Jane for their very detailed and thought-provoking presentation. It always brings to life a report that is so relevant, but it's so interesting to discuss it now with the latest developments and see its currency. It's how important is the report, the study, and the voices of those represented. And I want also to thank participants for these really interesting questions. And I would like to say goodbye, but before that, to invite you to the next lunch hour lecture that will bring a very topical aspect to discuss, which will be happening on the 19th of November. And the title will be From Threat to Opportunity, Putting Health at the Center of our Response to Climate Change. So I hope to see you in that lecture hour. And thanks again for the opportunity to share this really important research, and hope you have a great end of the day. So take care and see you soon.